When you think of reading a good Western, settings like Deadwood or Tombstone come to mind. It's so easy to forget that at one point in our nation's history, Minnesota was on the edge of the wild frontier. Candace Simar has written a series of 4 novels, in which most of the action takes place here in Lakes Country. We met Candace at the Grant County Museum, where she researched some of her material.
The Abercrombie Trail series consists of 4 novels. The first, Abercrombie Trail, tells the story of Evan Jacobson, a young Norwegian immigrant who gets a job driving the stagecoach from Fort Snelling to Fort Abercrombie during the Civil War. And the reason he gets the job is because all the men are off fighting the Civil War in the South. And he has this opportunity for a great job in the new land. And because he is driving the stage across Minnesota, he is the witness to what happens during the 1862 Sioux Uprising. And so it basically takes place from about 1860, and it ends right after the hanging in 1862. My family stories are intertwined in all of the 4 books. I had a great-grandfather who drove the stagecoach from Fort Snelling to Fort Abercrombie a few years after the uprising. In Abercrombie Trail, the immigrant story of Evan, the main character, is mostly my grandfather Nelson's experience of coming to America. And I was able to put the family stories in. It has been a delight for me to write these books. And my second book, Pommes De Terre, takes place right at the beginning of the uprising and the year afterwards. And the reason I wrote Pommes De Terre was because I discovered the little fort that used to be between Ashby and Elbow Lake, called Fort Pommes De Terre, along the Pommes De Terre River. And Patty Benson, the museum director, directed me over to some great research about a couple of young soldiers who were killed in 1863 while they were gathering goose eggs. I used that research, and that propelled my book, Pommes De Terre, about a young Scandinavian couple who find land becomes very cheap in western Minnesota, and they move to the Fort Pommes De Terre area when they shouldn't have, and what happened to them. I'd always heard that it was very difficult for the immigrants. My grandmother never had a doll. She played with stones. My great-grandfather did not have a horse, and he carried a 100-pound sack of wheat on his back to Sauk Center, to the mill, and back again for their winter's wheat supply, 40 miles. I do like to incorporate faith in my characters' lives, and in the 19th century, people were very religious. They were very concerned with how they lived. They were very concerned with moral issues. And maybe when times are very difficult, people tend to be more reliant on their faith. I also, in my books, I talk about the Mormon settlement in Clitheroe. I also have people exploring what kind of religion they want. And I like the idea of people thinking it through for themselves and not just going with what their parents or family wants. But I do like the details. I think the details make the story. I did use the book Ever the Land. I've always loved history. I grew up in a home where my immigrant grandparents lived upstairs, and I grew up hearing the stories of the family immigration. And I guess there's one in every family, but I was that listener who really loved those family stories. Across my travels, I had picked up the book Ever the Land at the Fergus Falls Museum. And that, of course, is an old biography of someone who settled in the Clitheroe area very early on, and he took great pains to describe how he built his dugout and his log cabin, and how he built a plow, and how he tamed the land in great detail. And I found it very helpful in my fiction to know some of those details. My third book, Birdie, is about a young girl who was kidnapped by the Sioux in 1862, along with her sister. And she comes back, but her sister has disappeared. And she is obsessed with finding her sister. And this book takes place in 1873 during the beginning of the grasshopper plagues. It left me with great admiration for the immigrants who were able to endure through such hard times. And then I thought I had written my trilogy. I was really happy to have it finished and published. And that night, the very night that I received my first hard copy of Birdie, I dreamed the opening section of the fourth book, Blooming Prairie. And I realized I had another book about these characters that would not let me go until I wrote. It takes place in 1876 during the middle of the grasshopper plagues and also during the Great Indian Scare after Custer is defeated in Montana. One set of my great-grandparents homesteaded over by Long Lake, not far from Tordenskjold Church. And my grandmother was born in the 1880s. And I remember the stories she would tell of hearing the Indians dancing and drumming in the woods at night. I tried to be very fair in my accounts of both the Native American and the immigrant. I felt that the story was so important that early on I decided just to write it the way it was, the way I found it in my research, and let readers make their own judgment on it. I really like how it turned out that way. I gained great sympathy for the Native Americans as I did my research. And we should have done better,
Yes.
which is what I think. And I've thought about that a lot, and it is my opinion that we need to understand our history, and it does not mean we agree with it.
Candace's novel, Birdie, received the Spur Award for Juvenile Fiction from the Western Writers of America, and Blooming Prairie was a Spur Award finalist. I really enjoyed reading these books, and if you are interested in Minnesota history, I think you will enjoy them too.